when they built the bridge, they made a typo. And so poor Verrazano is immortalized with only one Z.
So it's a beautiful night for baseball overlooking New York Harbor.
This is so Staten Island because this place has been here since 1937.
This feels like we're in a different time, a different place.
This alone is worth the trip to Staten Island.
Major funding for a walk around Staten Island is made possible by Richmond County Savings Foundation.
A decade of providing for places, programs, and people. The Richmond County Savings Foundation, over its first 10 years, has followed its mission to improve the quality of life in its communities. We invest in capital projects that offer dimension to our community, programs that offer choices and services, and people who offer hope.
And American Express. American Express is proud to join 13 in celebrating the historic heritage and cultural diversity of Staten Island. Historic preservation has long been the hallmark of American Express's involvement in the community. We are proud to support a walk around Staten Island, a chance to discover and experience Staten Island's unique history and culture. And by Richmond University Medical Center. Richmond University Medical Center on Staten Island's North Shore is proud to sponsor a walk around Staten Island, offering the highest quality of care. RUMC serves the medical needs of our growing community. Richmond University Medical Center, working harder to serve you better. And by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs.
I'll take Manhattan, the Bronx, and Staten Island, too. Don't quit the day job.
All right, how'd you know what I was thinking?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Anyway, Barry and I didn't take the other boroughs, but we did walk on Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, Manhattan, and now in this lovely free 25-minute ferry ride, we're finally heading out to Staten Island. Staten Island, least populated of all the boroughs, just shy of 500,000 people. It's the most rural borough, the most remote. It's got the highest percentage of Italians of any of the New York boroughs and the highest percentage of Republican voters, even though a lot of them are registered Democrats. Go figure. But
Well, something else Staten Island had was Cornelius Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilt of the Vanderbilts in the early 19th century. He makes his money on the Staten Island Ferry. Later on in the 19th century, invest that money in the New York Central Railroad and will build Grand Central Terminal. So every time you're in Grand Central, just remember, the money for that place, it was made on the boat we're on now.
Staten Island. Henry Hudson, on September 11th, 1609, what a coincidence, sailed into what is now New York Harbor for the Dutch. The Dutch named this island Staten Eiland, which is Dutch for Parliament in the Netherlands. If you look at a map of Staten Island, it's about 14 miles tall and about 7 miles wide. The New York Marathon starts here on the island. The runners run across the Verrazano Narrows Bridge into Brooklyn. The people of the island are really proud, and they're independent, even to the point of, at one point, trying to secede from New York City. How surprising is that?
Well, you know, it's a compact little island, and of course, being an island, it's surrounded by water, so that makes it insular. On the north side is the Kill Van Kull between it and Bayonne. On the west side, Arthur Kill between it and New Jersey. By the way, Kill is a Dutch word for stream or river. It has nothing to do with the Sopranos. And on the east side of the island, below the Verrazano Bridge, it's what Staten Island is called the South Shore, faces lower New York Bay. And the island itself, by the way, the most interesting topographical feature is the backbone of hills that runs from St. George deep into the center of the island. Staten Island is part of the Terminal Moraine, which runs through Brooklyn and Queens. It includes Tote Hill, which is the tallest spot on the East Coast below Mount Desert Island, 410 feet. I'm getting vertigo. Staten Island, by the way, has some beautiful Victorian neighborhoods stretching on the North Shore from St. George west to New Brighton, West Brighton, Port Richmond, and then on the east and south shores, just follow the Staten Island Rapid Transit, Stapleton, Rosebank, where the Alice Austin House is, all the way down to Tottenville. People can't believe how beautiful some of those houses are. as well as hilltop communities. Back in the 19th century, wealthy New Yorkers, wealthy Southerners, because they did so much business with us, built their houses there in the hills. Those hilltop communities are actually built on the backbone of the island, which is serpentinite. Serpentine?
Kryptonite?
Sounds
No?
like that, right? Well, it's green.
Yeah, it is.
And actually, that's the same rock we saw in Hoboken.
Huh. And as Barry said earlier, there is so much to do here. There's the Staten Island Museum. It is a wonderful museum. Some 65,000 adults and children go through it each year. It's arts and natural sciences. Much of the lighthouse technology of the last 150 years was accomplished here, so eventually they're going to build a maritime museum.
And in back of us is Borough Hall, 1906.
With a mansard roof.
Hey, David.
How am I doing,
I'm
Teach?
impressed. I really
Thank
am
you so
impressed.
much. Thank you.
Carrier and Hastings, who did our New York Public Library, did this in 1906. The interior was recently restored in the late 1990s. You have these murals inside from the WPA era of 1940. Frederick Starr did a series of historical murals. You know, about 3/4 of those murals are sites we're going to visit. Just up the street from us is the 1929 St. George Movie Palace, 2,800 seats. You know those great movie palaces, that kind of over-the-top style that just knocks your eyes out. 1972, by that time the movie palaces were out, it closes up. Rosemary Capozzalo and her daughters in 2004 form a nonprofit organization. They have done a remarkable job of restoring that interior. Finally, the St. George area of Staten Island. Staten Island itself has a wonderful venue for all kinds of live entertainment.
First stop is Snug Harbor. And this is the first of our Staten Island surprises. More than 25 buildings in a stunning architectural complex. What is this?
Don't you feel like you're on the top of the Acropolis with these great Greek revival temples in front of us? Well, where are we? We were just at St. George where the ferry lands. Now we're just a little ways down the north shore of Staten Island at Snug Harbor. And this is a story that goes back to 1801. Captain Robert Richard Randall dies in that year. He leaves in his will his land in what is now Greenwich Village and money for the founding of a home for retired merchant seamen. Captain Randall understood it was hard getting old when you're a merchant seaman. You know, you're all alone and you drink and all that. So he leaves his money in his land. His family fights the will for 30 years. Boy, that's an old story. Finally, the fight is settled in the early 1830s. By that time, Captain Randall's property in Greenwich Village is worth a fortune for luxury townhouses, which they build and is still there on the north side of Washington Square. The trustees of what they call Sailor's Snug Harbor buy this property, much cheaper land on the north shore of Staten Island.
How much is here?
83 acres. And they build these buildings we see, and by the early 1830s, the sailors start to show up. You know, by the early 1900s, there were 1,000 retired sailors living here.
What was this place like with 1,000 sailors in the same territory?
I think today we'd make a reality show out of it because you had the sailors, and you could imagine those hard-scrabble, salty dogs, and they were lorded over by these prissy trustees, very respectable, and they were appalled by the behavior of the sailors.
Well, I should hope so.
Oh, God, they had regulations this long, and the sailors said a few things to them that I can't say because we're on family television. Well, everything changes when Social Security came in the 1930s. In a sense, Sailors Snug Harbor was no longer needed. By the 1970s, the sailors are out of here. And in 1976, this becomes the Snug Harbor Cultural Center. Today, it shares the land with several other independent cultural organizations. And in fact, we're going to see one of those right now. Here on the Snug Harbor grounds, there are other independent cultural institutions like the Noble Maritime Collection, which has an entire houseboat inside the building. There's the Staten Island Children's Museum, which locals say is wonderful for the kids.
Very good.
Yes. And then there's the Staten Island Botanical Gardens, beautiful in themselves, but as part of the gardens, there is the Chinese Scholars Garden, which we're in right now. It's the only one of its kind in the United States. This alone is worth the trip to Snug Harbor and Staten Island. What an amazing place. This was built in 1998, designed by one of the leading garden designers from China. 40 artisans and craftsmen came over from Zhuzhou, which is a city west of Shanghai, to do this garden, and they lived here on the grounds while they built the garden with prefabricated architectural elements made in Zhuzhou. The Chinese garden goes back almost more than 2,000 years, but it really came into its own in the Ming Dynasty, about 14th to 17th century in our calendar. These gardens were built by scholars who in the Confucian system were high up in the court. They were basically court officials under a lot of pressure. One thing wrong, off with your head. So when they retired, they would retire to a house, and we are actually within a house in which part of the garden is an extension of the house. Beyond the house, other parts of the garden for walking, contemplating. In a Chinese garden, there's always a sense of variety, there's always a sense of surprise, there's always a sense of mystery. It's fascinating. There's a garden like this in the old city of Shanghai, much bigger, of course, but extraordinary how much this resembles gardens in China. Now, sometimes the scholar would take off his shoes and walk barefoot through the garden to feel underfoot all the different... Yes, you're right. He would also get a relaxing massage. We need this kind of thing in the 21st century. Isn't it amazing what you find on the grounds of Snug Harbor?
So it's a beautiful night for baseball overlooking New York Harbor, Richmond County Bank Stadium, and it's a minor league baseball team, a farm club of the New York Yankees. They call them the Baby Bombers. It's the Staten Island Yankees.
Well, I saw the real Yankees when I was 8 years old.
You did?
That's right. And it was my one and only baseball game.
You mean this is number 2?
That's right. And
I am honored. I am honored.
I
to be
remember
in
the Franks.
You mean the hot dog?
Yeah.
The Franks, okay.
The hot dog. Actually, my father was a baseball nut.
Yeah.
He had the baseball game on the radio in the car all the time.
Okay.
And you know something? I totally zoned it out. I don't even remember who he rooted for.
Here's another base hit for the Yankees. Oh, they're getting to this
Yes,
pitcher.
they are.
They're getting to this pitcher early. It's only the second inning. Before the term photojournalist was even coined, there was a great photojournalist here on Staten Island, spent her whole life here. Yes, her. And her name was Alice Austin, and she was awesome.
She was different.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Alice Austin is born in 1866 to a very comfortable family here on Staten Island. Her grandfather, back in 1844, bought this house. It was a 1690s Dutch farmhouse. He turns it into a beautiful, picturesque Gothic revival cottage, perfect for the site we're in, and what a site it is here on the Upper New York Bay. My goodness, coming out of this house every day with this view. Well, Alice's mother marries and has Alice, but the father abandons them almost immediately. So the mother moves back with her own father, and Alice is brought up in this house, clear comfort.
With her grandfathers.
Yes, and she was the only child in a house of adults, and they adored her.
Right.
We're here, David, here at the Alice Austin house, just north of the Verrazano Bridge, just down the coast of Staten Island from the St. George Ferry Terminal. And this is the Rosebank section of Staten Island. And by the way, clear comfort is not the only thing interesting in Rosebank. Right nearby is the Garibaldi Mucci Museum. Antonio Mucci was an inventor who might have invented the telephone, it's possible. And his guest, Giuseppe Garibaldi, oh, he's the George Washington of a modern unified Italy. He lives here in exile before he goes back to Italy in 1854 and gets the whole country together. Yeah. Around the corner from that, by the way, is a wonderful little grotto, an outdoor grotto. It's Our Lady of Carmel grotto, built in the 1930s by a grieving Italian father who had just lost his 5-year-old son. And I've seen grottos like that in Italy. I never would expect one here in New York City. Coming back to Alice Austin. Here she is at 22 years old.
Right, and look at her.
Wasn't she gorgeous? And that dress, it tells us so much about the age she grew up in. She was
Part
a
of the genteel society.
respectable
Not
young
work,
lady,
right.
but she was a respectable young lady with a difference.
Right.
She had a love for photography. The family supported her, and everywhere she went with her camera. Here's a picture of Clear Comfort back in the 19th century when she knew it. When she went with her friends on picnics, sailing. This is a wonderful photograph. You know, they think that during her lifetime she produced 9,000 photos, and there's about 3,500 of them still left.
And here, Lower Manhattan, East
The other
Side.
island she loved besides Staten Island was Manhattan Island. And when she went to the city, she was interested in the life of the city. This is not the kind of thing photographers took back then. Everything
But that's the
was staged.
photojournalist aspect. And also that her work reflects a period.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. You know,
That's
50
hard
years
to see.
later, there's another photojournalist who does the same thing. Her name is Bernice Abbott. You
right.
spoke about her in the Village video.
Exactly.
And here is a wonderful photograph of her maid and the dog on the steps of Clear Comfort right over there. You notice there's a sailboat in the background. An extraordinary, extraordinary career. Now, she spends her adult life with her love photography, but by the 1920s, the family fortune is dwindling. 1929 stock market crash, she loses everything. By 1945, she's impoverished. She loses the house. Her photographs, the plates, the photographs are taken over by the Staten Island Historical Society, but Alice herself had to go into the poorhouse of Staten Island up on the hill next to Seaview Tuberculosis Hospital.
Tragic.
Sad.
Tragic.
But in 1951, Staten Island Historical Society mounts an exhibit. She becomes known, and from the money that she was able to make through that exhibit, she was able to leave the poorhouse and get into a nursing home and spend the last year of her life in comfort. She dies in 1952. An amazing lady. What I love about her, a very complicated person. She was brought up to be a fine, genteel young lady of the upper class, but she never married. She never had a Victorian husband to say, Alice, come out of the darkroom and make me dinner. Not Alice.
Also, a fabulous athlete. She was a great tennis player.
Yes.
And rode her bike into New York.
And this was an age when women were finally being allowed to do that kind of thing. Alice was in the forefront of it all.
Here we are in the middle of Fort Wadsworth at water's edge, looking to New York Harbor with this magnificent view of Brooklyn, of Manhattan, Jersey City, Statue of Liberty. But more than that, we're standing in one of the most significant historical spots in America when you think militarily.
Well, and also in terms of economy, in terms of history, we're at the Narrows. The Narrows are like a pincer that pinches New York Harbor in two. The lower harbor facing the ocean, the upper harbor facing the city. That means that all the squalls of the Atlantic were kept out in the Atlantic, and that made New York Harbor safe for commerce, for trade. It's why New York became the great city it became.
And strategically, it's said that whoever controls this ground controls New York City.
That's right. And didn't they all know it from the American Indians?
Started, yeah, with the Native Americans, then the Dutch, then the English, then the Americans, and again, you know, the Brits, and then finally the Americans again. Absolutely, historically, right on through. But what's the history of this
Well,
place?
actually, the Americans finally got serious about fortifications here in anticipation of the War of 1812. Remember, New York was occupied during the Revolution. We did not want the British back for the War of 1812. We built Castle Clinton over in the Battery, Castle Williams and Governor's Island, and the two forts here. That was Fort Richmond, which is now Fort Wadsworth, and Fort Hamilton across in Brooklyn. Well, the British stayed out of New York. They went to Washington, and they burned Washington. Now, of course, people get a little confused. The whole area is Fort Wadsworth. We're in Battery Weed. Up above us is Fort Tompkins, which actually was built to protect Battery Weed. Basically, the fortifications we see right now date from the 1840s and 50s, designed, by the way, by Joseph Totten, for whom Fort Totten is named in Queens. This is an amazing piece of work, so minimalist and so modern. It's all granite. It's a battery with 3 tiers of casemates. That's the alcoves for the cannon. And when this was in operation, more than 100 cannon could bomb to smithereens anything coming through the net.
And it's only a mile over to Brooklyn, which
Well,
is not far when it comes to cannons.
Between Fort Hamilton and what is now Fort Wadsworth, you could smash anything out of the water.
You mentioned Robert E. Lee. When he was a younger officer, he was involved in making decisions about these fortifications. So 20 years later, In the Civil War, the Confederacy did have some ships sitting out at Sandy Hook. Did they come through the harbor? No. Lee knew, don't even take a chance.
He knew better. Well, it's interesting how fast technology changes. By the second half of the 19th century, actually, the military technology has advanced so much that this was obsolete in terms of military defense, but it maintained a military function right through the 1960s. You know, up until 1966, this was the control center for the Nike defense missile system for New York City.
Right. And in 1994, when the base closed, it was the longest continuously habited military base in the United States.
Well, thank goodness they gave it to the National Park Service. It's one of the most exquisite parks in the Gateway recreational area. And today, on the heights especially, the most magnificent views of New York Harbor. But since 1964, one of the greatest views from here is of this spectacular bridge, the Verrazano.
We'll return to a walk around Staten Island with David Hartman and historian Barry Lewis after this short break.
From a distance, the bridge is exciting to see and beautiful and all that. But when you get down under it, it's overwhelming. It's magnificent.
Isn't it a beautiful piece of construction? The man who designed this, Othmar Ammann, nobody knows his name today, but he was one of the brilliant bridge designers of the 20th century. His first great work was the 1931 George Washington Bridge. That's still considered one of the most beautiful bridges in the world. His last great work was the Verrazano Narrows, which is right in back of us. In between, he did the Bronx Whitestone Bridge, beautiful bridge. He did the three bridges that connect Staten Island with the mainland. That would be the Outer Bridge crossing, the Goethals Bridge, and the Bayonne. We just drove under the Bayonne, so beautiful. Well, in 1964, when the Verrazano opened, of course, we always call it the Verrazano. We never use all those syllables. And it's interesting, it was named for Giovanni da Verrazano, who was the first European to sail into the harbor back in 1524.
And by the way, his name has two Z's in it.
That's right. But when they built the bridge, they made a typo. And so poor Verrazano was immortalized with only one Z. When this bridge opened in 1964, Mr. Ammann was 85 years old, which means he designed this in his 80s. Amazing, right? I remember when I came back from Europe after 2 years being in Paris, and it was 1965, I sailed on the Queen Mary I in the last year of its operation, and we came in at dawn underneath the new Verrazano Bridge past the Statue of Liberty. It was one of the most thrilling events. Well, when this bridge opened, needless to say, it completely changed Staten Island.
We're really lucky because we have a young woman with us who writes for the New York Times. As importantly as that is, she's a native Staten Islander, and she is Maureen Seberg, and we're glad to have you with us.
Gentlemen, thanks for coming out to see us. Welcome.
BB and AB, which I've heard being out here in Staten Island, tell us what that means.
Well, before the bridge, it was somewhat agricultural. There were still working farms. It was bucolic and lovely in its way, but not very much a part of the city, not so much a part of the world, perhaps a little isolated. Then the bridge opened in 1964, and with it, the world arrived on our doorstep.
So what happened here in Staten Island as a result of the bridge, people being able just to drive over here?
Oh, what happened is, with John F. Kennedy Airport being the Ellis Island of my generation, this became a gateway to America, and many people first settled here.
So what happened with the population?
It exploded. It exploded. We went from an agrarian society to somewhat suburban and metropolitan.
To what extent did the Italian population increase as a result of the bridge being here?
It increased markedly, many of them coming from Brooklyn and the other boroughs. We're now, I believe, at 37.4% Italian people, so it continues to grow even now. But what's happening is, with the second greatest wave of immigration since the turn of the century happening as we speak, it's not just European folks anymore, it's everyone.
What are some of these other ethnic groups that have moved in?
Well, a couple of the really interesting ones, because I consider them perhaps not greatest in number, but world class in the sense that they are their nation's largest diasporas in America living here, are the Sri Lankans and the Liberians. In fact, two Sri Lankans, they just call Staten Island America. This is what they know. They call it America. And I've started to call it Little Lanka because there's so many of them, which is terrific.
Go back to when the bridge was built. Your parents were both from Staten Island?
No, my father is a native Staten Islander from Castleton Corners, and my mom's an Irish gal from Astoria. And I like to think that without that bridge, I wouldn't be standing here with you today, because I don't think she could have continued dating him were it not for the convenience. One of their first dates was to drive across it on opening day.
So they were in favor of the bridge?
Absolutely.
I wonder how many of the some 19 million people that live in metropolitan New York know that there is not only a beautiful sand beach here, but you can really swim in the water.
It's probably why the first European settlers settled here on South Beach, just north of where we are, back in 1661. They set up a little settlement at the foot of Ocean Avenue, which is just south of Fort Wadsworth, built themselves a little village called Ouddorp, eventually. Dutch for Old Town. And by the way, their leader, Pierre Bilieu, he built his farmhouse up on what is now Richmond Road in the Dongan Hill section of Staten Island. That house is still here. Some people know it as the Perrine House. It's one of the oldest houses now in New York City. Now, Ouddorp flourishes, and then the English take over in 1664. They take over all of New Netherlands, including New Amsterdam, which is, of course, now New York, Staten Island as well. They extend the settlement southward. They built a new part of town, and they call it Newdorp. Maybe their buildings aren't here anymore, but Newdorp is still one of the fine communities here on the east coast of Staten Island. Interestingly, by the 1690s, the Dorps lose out to Richmond Town, which we're going to see towards the end of the walk, which becomes the great 18th century center of Staten Island life. Now, this South Beach that we're on, this beautiful beach, this was a quiet backwater beach of a rural farming county until the 1880s, and then ferry service was set up from New York, where there already were 1 million people, and Brooklyn, which was the 4th largest city in the state.
Just like whenever you establish transportation, stuff happened.
And people came over here in droves. By the 1890s, South Beach rivals Coney Island as an amusement center, shooting galleries, dance halls, beer halls, Ferris wheels. And by 1906, South Beach got its own version of a Coney Island amusement park. It was called Happy Land.
Hello, Happy Land. But Coney Island lasted for decades.
Happy Land burned down in 1917, was never replaced, and there was a reason for that, because the waters that everyone came here to swim in by that time were getting too polluted. As a matter of fact, in 1917, the city forbade swimming here at South Beach. That's how bad the water was. Needless to say, South Beach goes down the tubes. By 1935, under the WPA program, same era, same program that created Orchard Beach in the Bronx, the city takes over all of South Beach, rips out the derelict old buildings, builds this beautiful boardwalk, calls it the FDR for the president. It's one of the longest boardwalks here in North America. Of course, it doesn't beat out Atlantic City, but it's very close to the Rockaway Boardwalk, which we saw in the Queen's Walk.
What is Great Kills Harbor?
Well, that's interesting. Today, it's a wild, rustic park. People think it was that way forever. Not really. Used to be landfill, which is a nice way of saying a garbage dump. 1949, the city transformed that garbage dump into that beautiful park we know today. It's not only people that enjoy that park. If you know anything about the monarch butterfly.
Tell me.
Well, they use it as a motel on their way south
Monarch Motel.
to their winter home in Mexico. I say, you spend summer in the north, you spend winter in Mexico. It's not bad being a monarch butterfly.
You know, you hear about a place and then figure, well, you know, how good can it be? Danino's? Oh, this is...
Isn't this fabulous?
Great.
Well, when people knew we were doing Staten Island, they said, you have to do Danino's here in Port Richmond. And they're absolutely right. This is so Staten Island because this place has been here since 1937, run by the same family.
And back in the corner, right, are two women, 91 and 88, and they're part of the family. And they're still at the desk at night taking names.
Sure. And when you finish at the Nino's, you go across the street, and you have dessert at Ralph's. Ralph's Ices. Been here since 1928. Same spot, same family. Now, it's interesting that these two places date back to before World War II. Where did they set up shop? But in the Port Richmond area of Staten Island, it's right there at the foot of the Bayonne Bridge. It was the downtown of Staten Island until the Verrazano opened up. Then the new population lived inland, new shopping malls. Port Richmond had the same problem all the old downtowns did. Now you have a Mexican population, opening Mexican stores there on Port Richmond Avenue. So these areas are coming back.
And rooted in places like this that help maintain the cohesiveness of this community. It's wonderful.
And I'll stay cohesive around pizza any day.
And you're doing a good job. Farm Colony, Seaview Hospital, now Rehabilitation Center. Where are we in the map?
Well, we're right here, Seaview and Farm Colony, right on the backbone of Staten Island. Actually, we're on Toad Hill.
And here is a drawing, a sketch of what this place looked like many decades ago.
Well, we're in this building right here. Some of these buildings have been demolished for the geriatric center that now occupies the site. But some of these original buildings are here in decayed state.
And here we are. Tom Mateo is a doctor of education. He is the historian for the borough of Staten Island and a former director of the Seaview Hospital Rehabilitation Center. Tom, it's nice to have you with us.
Hi.
Tom, let's go back to the farm colony. What was the farm colony?
Farm Colony was actually the poorhouse for Staten Island. The very first poorhouse in New York City was built on the site of City Hall. Now, Staten Island's development was no different. The only real difference was Staten Island was the first one to have work there. So the people who lived there worked there to help sustain themselves. It was a real, live, operating farm.
For how long?
It started in the 1800s, and it lasted until the 1960s, although the working of it as a farm stopped just before the Depression.
Now, go back to Seaview Hospital. When was Seaview created and why?
Tuberculosis was killing 10,000 New Yorkers a year. It was called consumption, the White Plague. This is the only second sanitarium built specifically for tuberculosis in the entire country. The construction started here about 1908 and continued as the population grew through 1938. And at one time, they had over 2,000 patients. And all the services they needed, laundry, bakery, kitchen, everything they needed.
How successful was this place in helping the patients?
Well, as you know, the very first cure that people believed was going to work for TB was fresh air and sunlight. And that's why they picked this place. It's on top of a hill, one of the highest points on the eastern seaboard. It was designed to maximize airflow and sunlight. We are standing in the ward. And the way this was constructed, on both sides, we have porches so that all the residents could be outdoor at the same time, getting fresh air and sunlight.
What about the tiles that we noticed on the top floor?
Actually, we have tiles around the building, but specifically around the top, just under the eave, are some gorgeous Delft tiles made in Holland of scenes of nurses, doctors, children. In fact, all 8 buildings had those tiles up there. Around 1950s, Dr. Robotchek and his colleagues started playing around with a chemical that was made at Rutgers University. But they didn't know what the mixture was. So rather than wait for clinical trials, they decided too many people are dying. And they went forward with experiments right here.
Criticized probably for that.
Absolutely. But they feel that they saved 2 to 3 million lives by not waiting for the clinical trials to be over. So they found the cure actually around 1956, 1957. And the last patient left in, I think, 1973. And people were leaving here in droves. It was just like a miracle cure.
We are basically in the middle of Staten Island on Toad Hill. Moravian Cemetery is the largest cemetery on Staten Island. It contains approximately 200,000 burials, and it is a non-sectarian cemetery. The cemetery is 114 acres. It contains 2 freshwater lakes. In 1776, there was 20,000 British troops stationed here on Staten Island. They needed water, so they came here to the Moravian Pond. One of the oldest gravestones is of Colonel Nicholas Britton, who passed in 1740. Our second oldest stone is of Rachel, the first wife of Thomas Dungan, who was the son of Thomas Dungan, who was the first colonial governor of the New York State. We also have the first Vanderbilt mausoleum that was built in 1865. Well, I like to visit George Parker. He died in the Civil War. He has a unique white bronze monument. They call it white bronze. The name sounds more appealing because it's actually made of zinc. Well, I believe in promoting local history, and this is my way of keeping history alive by telling our residents real-life stories.
For some 200 years, Richmond Town, where we are now, was the center of government and commercial life here on Staten Island. Well, in 1898, when Staten Island became part of New York City, the decision was made, move the center of government and commercial life up to the northeast corner of the island. And this, Richmond Town, was essentially deserted. What do you do with a deserted town?
Well, I think in a city where anything that's 5 minutes old is considered too old and knocked down, I think we need to preserve this and show people how we lived 200 years ago, 100 years ago, and that's what they're doing in Richmond Town today. Well, why is Richmond Town where it is? You see from this old map, it's in the geographic center of Staten Island where everybody could access it easily. It straddled 2 of the main roads crisscrossing the island. You can still see these roads in maps today. By the 1890s, commercial activity is moving up to Port Richmond on the Kilvan Col, right opposite Bayonne. Do you remember Donino's?
Sure.
Well, that was Port Richmond.
Yeah.
And then, as you said, in 1898, the Manhattan-centric City Hall decided to take Borough Hall out of Richmond Town. This was the county center, and move it up to St. George. Well, that killed Richmond Town. I mean, after 1898, this place became practically deserted. But in the 1930s, volunteers from the Staten Island Historical Society come in and they start to try to restore some of the buildings in the town. They start with, in the 1930s, the Four Lasers House, which we'll see in a moment, the 1837 courthouse, which is right in back of us, the 1848 county clerk's office, which is just across the street. By the 1960s, they move 11 old buildings here to Richmond Town that would have been demolished if they hadn't been moved.
From other parts of the island.
That's right. That's right. And today there are 27 buildings in total. 15 of those buildings have been restored.
So you can really come here and experience essentially a living history
That's right.
of 300 years.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what's even more amazing, do you know Europeans, not New Yorkers, but Europeans come here, and the reason is the house we're going to see next, the Four Lasers House from 1695.
Four Laser. What does that mean?
The Voorlezer was in the Dutch Reformed Church. He was a lay minister and a teacher. Voorlezer. He's the man who stands in front of the congregation or the students and reads to them. Dutch Voorlezer. Well, this house was built around 1695, maybe 1696. It wasn't just a house. It was a school, it was a church on Sunday, and it was where the Voorlezer lived. He lived in the room in back of us. It's a single room with all the furniture pushed up against the walls.
So he could use it for other stuff?
That's absolutely right. And there's a second assembly room upstairs, and there's a kitchen in the basement underneath us.
Fireplace here too, though.
Oh, of course, because a fireplace would be the main source of heat.
So what's the design of this building that tells you what it is?
Well, for one thing, it's a very simple wood frame building with plaster walls, exposed beam ceiling. By the way, Dutch elements include the double door. You close the bottom door to keep out the animals, the goats, etc., but open the top for air. Yeah. But what I find fascinating are the Dutch-style casement windows. The Dutch use casement windows. That means a window set in a case that you open up like a shutter.
These look really old.
Well,
With the glass.
they might look old, but they aren't. This house underwent restoration beginning in the 1930s by historic Richmond Town, but in the 1980s, further restoration, they put back these Dutch-style 17th century windows, and for that purpose, they used a blacksmith just down the road, and he's still in operation today. Can you imagine a blacksmith in New York City in the 21st century? That's so Staten Island.
We'll return to a walk around Staten Island with David Hartman and historian Barry Lewis after this short break.
Two Staten Islands, as Maureen Seberg suggested, BBAB, before the bridge, after the bridge. After the bridge, with the explosion of development and building, the people who wanted to preserve the habitat of this place came out of the woodwork and allowed this green belt, it's called, to be a real thing and important here.
And we're right in the middle of it, on one of the highest points in the Greenbelt. The irony of it is the entire Greenbelt is natural except for the spot we're on. We are on what is colloquially called Mount Moses, or Moses Mountain, and the reason it's so high, actually we're standing on the debris from what Robert Moses hoped to be the Richmond Parkway.
Is that why it's Moses? Because it was the
That's
Moses?
right, that's why they call it Mount Moses, because he's the man who created it, like he created so much of New York City. Luckily, he didn't get his way with that parkway, and the Greenbelt is still here for us to enjoy.
Right. Adina Long is the administrator of the Greenbelt, and it's nice to be on your mountain. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.
How difficult, how challenging, how tough was it for all of you to not only maintain this place, but make sure it would be maintained for a long time?
It's extremely difficult. The Parks Department oversees about 2,000 acres of the Greenbelt, but all in all, it's nearly 3,000 acres. So there's both city, state, and private land that encompasses what is the Greenbelt.
And for people who know about Central Park, this area is about 3 times the size of Central Park?
3 times the size of Central Park.
If any of us come out here in our hiking boots and our binoculars, what's here?
Well, we have just about 36 miles of hiking trails. And one of our star programs is environmental education.
How many people get here on a
I would
regular
say
basis?
10 years ago, we estimated 1 million a year. So I would say we're close to twice that now.
That's amazing. 2 million people, and yet we're standing here, and it's just us in the middle of New York City.
It feels like solitude, and it's one of the reasons why it's such a special place, both recreationally and naturally. It's an important place for us to continue to protect.
We're adjacent to Fresh Kills. What's the future for Fresh Kills?
Well, Fresh Kills is 2,200 acres. As it is developed into a park, it's already begun the process, but it will probably be complete within 20 to 30 years. There are already public meetings going on with regards to what the community is interested in seeing in the park, whether it's active recreation or passive recreation.
So what would the creation of Fresh Kills as a park mean to the adjacent Greenbelt?
Well, it would mean that the 2,200 acres of Fresh Kills, along with the 3,000 some odd acres of the Greenbelt, would make it the largest semi-contiguous tract of open land in New York City.
Hardly a day goes by that we don't hear at least one person say, if there's anything you want, you can find it in the city of New York. In this case, it is a collection of Tibetan art that is one of the most significant collections in the world outside of Tibet. Who is Jacques Marchais?
Well, first of all, Jacques was a woman. When she was born, her father wanted a boy, and he wanted the name Jacques, not Jacqueline, and so she is called Jacques Marchais.
And she stuck with it.
Yes, she did. Yes, she did. And it shows you, again, like with Alice Austen, it meant that she was going to be different for the rest of her life, and she was. When she grows up, she gets married, young, has 3 children, but it's really not the life for her. And she and her husband amicably separate. The kids go to the grandparents. Eventually, they'll come back to live with Jacques Marchais, but she goes off in 1916 to America's Bohemia, Greenwich Village. It's the village of John Sloan and Edna St. Vincent Millay. It's the village of the 1910s and early 20s. And one of the things those Bohemians were interested in was Eastern mysticism. Jacques Marchais becomes absolutely almost obsessed by that subject. She marries a fellow, Harry Klauber, and he was a wealthy businessman who supported her with his money and her eye. She builds this wonderful collection of Tibetan art. She originally had a gallery in Manhattan.
Right, on the Upper East Side.
That's right.
And bought and sold and really was in the business.
But she felt that her collection needed the right setting, and she was right. In 1921, she and Harry buy this parcel of land we're in now on the eastern edge of Lighthouse Hill here in Staten Island. And she builds what she would call a spiritual or meditative garden. And so in the 1940s, she builds these 2 contiguous structures, and she creates an amalgam of a very simple fieldstone house with Tibetan architectural elements, the trapezoidal windows, the exposed beams, the flat parapet, all of that is very Tibetan, but it's very much Jacques Marchais.
But this is not a museum.
No, it's not. No, and I don't think she'd even care for that term. It really is a center of spirituality. And actually, when people come here, it's not only for the collection in those buildings, but also for the garden we're sitting in. In the publicity, it talks about the quietness of this garden. Now I said, look, within 100 miles of New York, nothing to be quiet. But you know it is. In 1991, when the 14th Dalai Lama, now the Dalai Lama is the political and religious head of Tibet, but in exile since 1959 in India. But when the 14th Dalai Lama visited here in the early 90s, he said how much it reminded him of his homeland, Tibet. That is fascinating because Jacques Marchais, because of her ill health, she was never able to visit the country she loved so much.
En México yo empecé como a los 10 años a cultivar elotes, calabazas, frijoles. Y esa es la tradición y ya nos vinimos para acá, entonces mi cuñado me dijo que había algún terreno para cultivar y yo me gustaba y es como estamos ahorita aquí en estos lugares. Tenemos casi, por decir, 2 acres de terreno y aquí cultivamos tomatillos, también cultivamos super chile, que la gente siempre nos ha buscado por eso. Cultivamos flores también para el Día de los Muertos. Y varios productos mexicanos cultivamos acá. Pues acá nosotros vendemos en el Green Market San George. Tenemos bastantes clientes porque llevamos mucho producto mexicano que es lo que más se consume. Que esta granja es de Decken Farm. Y es la que, bueno, es la historia que tiene varios años acá y pues es la única que ha existido y sigue existiendo, las tradiciones de los tiempos pasados.
We're on the east shore of the island, Raritan Bay, and this feels like we're in a different time, a different place.
My question is, where's Scarlett? We're in front of the Seguin house from 1837. Now, the Seguins were here from the early 1700s, and they built themselves up quite a fortune through farming, through cattle raising, through oyster farming. They had huge oyster farm down here. As a matter of fact, because of the oysters, they had a pearl button factory. And Seguin was also a partner with the Vanderbilts in the Staten Island Ferry and what became the Staten Island Rapid Transit. They make themselves a bundle of money. By 1837, Joseph Seguin builds them this beautiful Greek Revival house. It's in the same era and same style as Snug Harbor, which we saw at the beginning of the tour, and the Bartow Pell Mansion, which we saw up in the Northeast Bronx. It's a magnificent house. Originally, when Seguin built it, it had 200 acres.
Well, I understand now it may be the largest single parcel of privately owned land in the city of New York.
You know, it's interesting. Only a short distance from here, in the 1850s, Frederick Law Olmsted had his working farm. He's going to go on to co-design Central Park by the next decade. So this was really quite a place to live. In the late 1960s, a local Tottenville boy, George Burke, bought the property from the Seguins. The house, well, it left a lot to be desired by that point. George has spent these last 40-odd years putting this house back in shape. You see how magnificent it looks today. He has every intention of leaving it to the Historic House Trust of the New York City Parks Department, which means one day it's going to be our property.
Sandy Ground got its name from the soil. The soil is sandy. It's just that simple. It is in the state and national registers as the oldest continuously inhabited Black community in the United States, with descendants of the original settlers still living in the community. So it's the continuity of the community that makes it historically significant. There were two major groups of settlers, and the first group that came in were people who came from the New York City area, and they came out here immediately after slavery was abolished in New York. And they found something that would grow well in the sandy soil, and they became strawberry farmers. The second group, and the most significant group, were the oystermen who came in from Maryland after repressive laws drove them out of that state, and they came here and settled and made a community that grew to 150 families, 2 churches, 2 schools. And at this point, we have 10 families and the church, and this museum, which serves as, I say, a school, because we see about 2,000 school children a year coming here to learn this part of Staten Island and this part of African American history. I've lived in Staten Island all of my life. I love Staten Island. I love Staten Island.
Here we are at the very southern tip of Staten Island, or the South Pole of New York State.
Well, people in Tottenville, and we are in Tottenville, would say this is the beginning of New York State. You know, Tottenville still has the charm of an old Staten Island town with a wonderful little shopping main street. You think you're in the 19th century.
All right, something happened here a long time ago, and that day has become, I'm not exaggerating, one of the most significant days in the history of our country. Go back with me, summer 1776. The revolution is on. The war has moved from Boston down to New York. Down in Philadelphia, Jefferson essentially has written the Declaration of Independence. Continental Congress, giving it 2 thumbs up. They're going to break from Britain at the very same time. Camped out here on Staten Island, right here, more than 30,000 British and mercenary German troops, and out in New York Harbor, more than 120 British ships. Well, in mid-August, those troops all go over to Long Island for the Battle of Brooklyn on the 27th of August. As you know, the Brits won decisively. Miraculously, George Washington and the colonials escape in the fog and the rain that morning of the 30th of August, and they escape to Manhattan. So what happens then? Lord Admiral Howe, who is here, the overall commander of the Brits, sends an emissary, a messenger down to Philadelphia, a captured American officer, and says, send somebody up here to talk. Let's avoid this war. Let's negotiate. So who comes? Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, John Adams of Massachusetts, Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, who, by the way, is only 27 years old. They horseback and carriage, stay overnight in New Brunswick, come across to Perth Amboy, right across the river here.
Well, actually, that makes sense, because Perth Amboy in those days was the gateway from New York to Philadelphia.
Perfect. And so Lord Admiral Howe sends his barge rowing across, picks up the three colonial leaders, and they come over here to the shore. Howe meets them right here, and they walk up to Christopher Billups' house to talk. Now, there were Hessian, German mercenary soldiers staying here in the house. We read that the place stank to high heaven, worse than a stable. And so they put moss and pine boughs on the floor, set up a table, had something to eat, some mutton, some ham, and we read a good claret. And this peace conference went on for 3 hours. Howe did most of the talking. He was not authorized to do anything except grant pardons. He really wanted us to surrender. In fact, he said, tread back this step of independency. Well, Franklin and the others would have none of that. They represented all the colonies, and they had broken from Great Britain, period. And so Franklin looked at Howe and said, I am not a British subject. And the other two followed suit.
Wasn't that pretty gutsy of them? I mean, we had just been routed in the Battle of Long Island.
Absolutely. But the colonies had decided, the Continental Congress had decided, we have broken with Great Britain. This was the last time that the two sides spoke until the war was over some 7 years later. The date of this peace conference, and it gives me chills to say this, was September 11th, 1776, 9/11/76. A week ago, Barry and I stepped off the ferry and have spent a wonderful week here in Staten Island. Special thanks to all of you who welcomed us so warmly with such enthusiasm, and we're grateful that you shared so many human stories with us. Not only good stories, of course, but there were sad ones as well, because some 270 Staten Islanders lost their lives in the Twin Towers on 9/11. What we sensed so strongly here, it wasn't just the families of the victims that came together to support each other. It was all of Staten Island that came together to support those families.
That's because Staten Island has always had a special relationship to downtown and the uniformed services. It's a result of the ferry making it so convenient to live here and work in the city. That's why so many Staten Islanders were lost on 9/11. That's why Staten Islanders wanted their own memorial. They asked Masayuki Isono, a Japanese architect, to design for them this memorial, which he calls postcards symbolizing greetings. Inscribed on the inside of these two curving postcards are the names of those lost not only in 2001, but in 1993. The postcards rise up, in a sense, rising up into the sky and beautifully framing downtown Manhattan.
For Barry and me and all of us here at the Walking Tours, make it a good evening.
Want to know more about Staten Island? Find us on the web at 13.org. Major funding for a walk around Staten Island is made possible by Richmond County Savings Foundation.
A decade of providing for places, programs, and people. The Richmond County Savings Foundation, over its first 10 years, has followed its mission to improve the quality of life in its communities. We invest in capital projects that offer dimension to our community, programs that offer choices and services, and people who offer hope.
And American Express. American Express is proud to join 13 in celebrating the historic heritage and cultural diversity of Staten Island. Historic preservation has long been the hallmark of American Express's involvement in the community. We are proud to support a walk around Staten Island, a chance to discover and experience Staten Island's unique history and culture. And by Richmond University Medical Center. Richmond University Medical Center on Staten Island's North Shore is proud to sponsor a walk around Staten Island. Offering the highest quality of care, RUMC serves the medical needs of our growing community. Richmond University Medical Center, working harder to serve you better. And by public funds from the New York City Department